Everyone in that shower room thought they were about to watch an easy humiliation, until the moment no one could explain. The sound of water echoed sharply against the cold tile walls, a steady rhythm that filled the space like a heartbeat, but beneath it, something else was building, something quieter, heavier, the kind of silence that made people shift on their feet without knowing why, and in the far corner of the prison showers, under a flickering fluorescent light, stood a man who didn't belong in anyone's idea of a threat. Marcus Reed was 72 years old, his frame lean, his posture slightly curved. With age, his left sleeve hanging empty where his arm used to be, and yet there was nothing fragile about the way he stood, nothing uncertain in the way his eyes moved slowly across the room, taking everything in without turning his head, without drawing attention, just watching, always watching, but the men around him didn't see any of that. All they saw was an old black man, alone, quiet, one arm missing, standing in the wrong place at the wrong time, and for Tyler Collins, that was all the invitation he needed. Tyler was already smiling before he even stepped forward, the kind of smile that spread easily in places like this, fed by boredom, by power, by the need to remind everyone exactly who controlled the space. His boots scraped lightly against the wet floor as he moved closer, his crew falling in behind him like they'd done 100 times before, forming a loose circle without needing to be told. The kind of formation that turned a room into a stage, and a man into a target. A few of the other inmates glanced over but quickly looked away, not wanting to be part of it, but not daring to ignore it either, because in this block, everything that happened in the showers meant something, every move was a message, every moment a test, and right now, the test had found Marcus Reed. Tyler stopped just a few feet away, tilting his head slightly as if studying something strange, something out of place, his voice cutting through the steam with a mocking edge that carried across the room, low enough to feel personal, loud enough for everyone to hear, but Marcus didn't answer, didn't react, didn't even shift his weight, he just stood there, breathing slow and steady, like the noise around him didn't exist, like the circle tightening around him wasn't real, and that was the first thing that felt wrong, not to the men laughing, not to Tyler, but to the few who had been inside long enough to recognize the difference between fear and something else, because fear moved, fear avoided eye contact, fear tried to disappear, but Marcus didn't do any of that. He stayed exactly where he was, exactly as he was, as if the situation had already played out in his mind and the outcome was no longer in question. Tyler's grin widened as he stepped closer, lifting a hand as if to gesture, to provoke, to push just a little further, because that's how these moments always escalated, one small move, then another, until the whole room leaned in waiting for the result. But what Tyler didn't notice, what none of them noticed, was the way Marcus adjusted his stance by less than an inch, the subtle shift of his feet against the tile. The quiet alignment of his shoulders, the almost invisible change in his center of gravity, small details, easy to miss, unless you knew exactly what they meant, and no one in that room did, not yet, but they were about to learn, because in a place built on noise and dominance, the most dangerous thing in that moment wasn't the laughter, it wasn't the numbers, it wasn't even Tyler Collins. It was the silence of a man who had nothing to prove, and everything already under control. The laughter lingered in the humid air, bouncing off concrete and steel, but it no longer carried the same weight it had a moment before, because something subtle had shifted, something almost invisible, and a few of the older inmates felt it before they understood it, the way the room seemed to tighten, the way the usual noise lost its edge, like a storm pausing just before it changed direction. Tyler Collins did not notice any of that. He was too focused on the reaction he expected, the flinch, the hesitation, the small step backward that always came when someone realized they were outnumbered, outmatched, and alone, but Marcus Reed gave him none of it, not even a glance that could be mistaken for fear, just that same steady breathing, that same stillness that now felt less like weakness and more like something deliberate, something chosen. Tyler's smile flickered for half a second, barely noticeable, but enough to plant the first seed of irritation, because control in a place like this depended on predictability, on knowing exactly how people would respond, and Marcus was not following the script. One of the younger men in Tyler's group shifted his weight, glancing sideways as if waiting for a signal, for the moment when this turned into something more, but the signal did not come, not yet. Instead Tyler leaned in slightly, lowering his voice, speaking in a tone meant to cut, meant to provoke, the kind of voice that had broken confidence in men twice Marcus's size, yet the words seemed to land without effect, like they had nowhere to go, nowhere to stick. Marcus's eyes moved then, slowly, not toward Tyler's face, but across the space between them, measuring distance, angles, positions, the kind of quiet observation that went completely unnoticed by those who did not know what to look for, but to someone trained, it would have been unmistakable, a mind mapping the room in real time, not reacting, not guessing, just understanding, and that was when one of the older inmates near the wall straightened slightly, his expression tightening as recognition brushed against memory, because he had seen that kind of awareness before, years ago, in a different place, under very different circumstances, and it had not ended the way anyone expected. The sound of running water continued, steady and indifferent, but now it seemed louder, as if it was the only thing willing to break the silence that had begun to spread. Tyler finally stepped closer, closing the last bit of space, his presence filling the gap like a wall, and for a brief moment, the entire room focused on that single point, waiting for something to happen. Anything to confirm that this was still the same familiar pattern, but Marcus did something that no one in that room anticipated. He spoke, not loudly, not with anger, but with a calm that carried further than any raised voice could have, his tone even, measured, the kind of voice that did not ask for attention but commanded it anyway, and though the words themselves were simple, they carried a weight that did not match the man the others thought they were dealing with. Because it was not a plea, not a protest, not even a warning, it was a statement, the kind that ended conversations before they began, and for the first time since he stepped forward, Tyler Collins did not immediately respond, not because he was unsure of what to say, but because something deeper, something instinctive, told him that whatever came next was no longer entirely in his control, and in a place where control was everything, that realization was far more dangerous than anything visible. The words Marcus Reed spoke did not echo, yet they settled into the room with a weight that no one could ignore, not because they were loud or dramatic, but because they carried a certainty that felt out of place in a moment built on intimidation, and for a brief second, even the steady rush of water seemed to fade into the background, as if the entire space was listening. Tyler Collins held his position, his expression tightening just slightly, the kind of subtle shift that most would miss but that his crew noticed immediately, because they had learned to read him, to follow even the smallest signal, and right now, that signal was not as clear as it should have been. One of the men behind him let out a short laugh, trying to fill the silence, trying to push the moment back into familiar territory, but the sound felt forced, thin, like it did not belong anymore. Marcus did not move, but something about him had changed, not in posture, not in expression, but in presence, as if the calm he carried was no longer passive, no longer just a reaction to the situation, but something active, something intentional, his gaze steady, his breathing controlled, every detail aligned in a way that spoke of discipline rather than chance. And somewhere near the edge of the room, the older inmate who had been watching earlier felt that recognition sharpen into certainty. Because this was not the stillness of someone waiting for things to happen, this was the stillness of someone who had already decided how things would unfold. Tyler finally broke the pause, his voice returning, but now there was a different edge to it, less amusement, more insistence, as if he needed to reassert the balance that had slipped. He shifted his stance, taking half a step closer, closing space that had already been measured, already accounted for, and without realizing it, he was moving exactly where Marcus had expected him to move, exactly where the invisible lines in that room had already been drawn. One of the younger men reached out slightly, not fully committing, just enough to test the boundary, to see how far this could go before something pushed back, and in that moment, the tension became almost tangible, like the air itself had weight, pressing against every movement, every breath. But Marcus did not retreat, did not resist in the way they anticipated. Instead he adjusted again, a minimal shift, barely noticeable, aligning himself with a precision that no one in that circle understood. And that was the second mistake, not an action, not a word, but a misunderstanding of what they were actually facing, because to them, this was still a situation of numbers and presence, of pressure and dominance. But to Marcus, it had already become something else entirely, a matter of timing, of positioning, of reading intent before it fully formed, and the difference between those two perspectives was about to change everything. The older inmate lowered his gaze slightly, not out of fear, but out of respect for what he now knew was coming, because he had seen men like Marcus before, men who did not raise their voices, who did not rush, who did not need to prove anything to anyone in the room, And those were always the ones who left the deepest impact, not through chaos, but through control. Tyler's crew did not see any of that, they only saw hesitation, and they mistook it for weakness, just like they had at the start, just like they always did, and that misunderstanding, that small gap between perception and reality, was now the only thing holding the moment together before it shifted completely beyond their reach. The moment did not explode the way anyone expected, it shifted, quietly, almost invisibly, like a balance tipping that only a few could feel, and then suddenly everyone was part of it whether they understood it or not. The younger inmate who had reached forward hesitated just long enough for uncertainty to creep in, and that hesitation spread like a ripple, subtle but undeniable. Because in a place where dominance relied on momentum, even the smallest pause could unravel everything. Marcus Reed remained exactly where he was. But now his stillness carried a different meaning. It was no longer just calm, it was control, the kind that did not need to be announced, the kind that made other people second-guess their own actions. Tyler Collins sensed it, even if he could not fully define it. His jaw tightened, his shoulders squared slightly as if trying to push the moment back into something familiar, something he could command. But the room was no longer responding to him the same way, the energy had shifted, the unspoken agreement that usually guided these encounters had broken, and no one knew how to reset it. Marcus's eyes moved once more, slow and precise, not avoiding anyone, not challenging anyone, just observing, and in that observation there was a clarity that felt almost unsettling, as if every movement around him had already been accounted for, every possible outcome already understood. One of the men behind Tyler took a small step back without realizing it, the slick floor beneath his boots suddenly feeling less stable than before. The laughter that had filled the room only moments ago was gone now, replaced by a silence that was heavier, more deliberate, the kind that made even the sound of water seem distant. Tyler shifted his weight again, this time more noticeably, and for the first time since he had stepped into that space, there was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes, not fear, not yet, but something close to recognition, the kind that comes when instinct begins to override ego, when something deep inside signals that the situation is no longer what it appeared to be. Marcus did not capitalize on that hesitation, did not move forward, did not escalate, and that restraint was what made the moment even more powerful, because it removed the expectation of reaction, it forced everyone else to confront the space that remained, to decide what came next without the usual cues. And in that absence of action, the true shift became undeniable. The older inmate near the wall exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging something inevitable, because he understood now that this was never about confrontation, it was about presence, about a level of composure that could not be shaken by numbers or noise. Tyler glanced briefly at his crew, searching for the familiar reinforcement of confidence, but what he found instead were uncertain looks, small signs that the certainty they had walked in with was no longer intact, and that was the third mistake, not recognizing that the moment had already passed, that whatever outcome they had expected was no longer available. Marcus Reed stood unchanged at the center of it all, not as a target, not as a victim, but as something else entirely, something the room had not yet fully named, but was beginning to understand. And as the seconds stretched just a little longer than they should have, it became clear to everyone present that the balance of that space had shifted, quietly, completely, and without a single unnecessary move. No one moved, and that was the moment everything truly changed, not when voices were raised or when space was invaded, but when nothing happened at all, because in a place like this, silence was never empty. It meant calculation, it meant uncertainty, it meant that something unseen had taken control of the situation. Marcus Reed stood as he had from the beginning, unchanged, but now the stillness around him felt deliberate, like a center point that everything else was orbiting without permission. Tyler Collins felt it in a way he had not felt in years, not as fear, but as a disruption, a break in the pattern he had relied on to maintain control, and patterns were everything here, routines, reactions, predictable outcomes. That was how order was enforced, but Marcus was not following any of those rules, and that made him dangerous in a way that strength alone never could. Tyler straightened slightly, drawing in a breath as if to reset the moment, to bring it back under his control, his voice returning, sharper now, more forceful, but even as he spoke, it lacked the easy confidence it had carried before, because confidence required certainty, and certainty had slipped through his fingers without him noticing when. Marcus listened, not with defiance, not with submission, but with a kind of quiet patience that made the words lose their edge before they even reached him. And that was what unsettled the room more than anything else, not resistance, but the absence of reaction, the refusal to engage on the level that everyone else understood. One of the younger men shifted again, this time stepping slightly to the side, creating a small gap in the circle that had once been tight and deliberate. And that gap did not go unnoticed, not by Marcus, not by the older inmate near the wall, and certainly not by Tyler, who caught it in his peripheral vision and felt something tighten in his chest, because gaps meant weakness, and weakness spread quickly if it was not contained, but he could not close it the way he normally would, not without forcing something that no longer felt natural. Marcus's gaze passed over that opening briefly, not as an opportunity, but as a confirmation, as if he had already anticipated it, as if the structure of the moment had been clear to him from the start, and that realization, though subtle, carried a weight that began to settle into everyone present, the realization that they were no longer shaping what was happening, they were reacting to something they did not fully understand. The water continued to run, steady and indifferent, but now it felt distant. Like the room itself had shifted away from the physical and into something more controlled, more precise. Tyler lowered his chin slightly, studying Marcus more carefully now, not as a target, but as a variable he had failed to account for, and in that shift of perspective, the dynamic between them changed completely, because once someone stopped seeing you as predictable, they also stopped knowing how to control you. Marcus adjusted his stance once more, the smallest movement yet, barely perceptible, but it carried the final piece of alignment, the final confirmation that whatever came next would not be decided by numbers or noise, but by something far quieter, far more disciplined, and for the first time since he stepped forward, Tyler did not immediately act. He paused, just for a fraction of a second, but in that environment, a fraction was all it took. The older inmate closed his eyes briefly, not in fear, but in recognition, because he understood what that pause meant. It meant the moment had already passed, it meant the outcome had already shifted, and no one in that room, not even Tyler Collins, had realized exactly when it happened, only that it had, and that nothing would play out the way it was supposed to anymore. The pause stretched just long enough to become undeniable, not an accident, not hesitation born from confusion, but something deeper, something that forced every person in that room to confront a reality they were not prepared for, because in a place built on immediate reactions, on fast dominance and quicker submission, a pause like that meant control had slipped, and once it slipped, it rarely returned the same way. Tyler Collins felt it fully now, not as a passing thought, but as a weight settling into his awareness, his usual instincts telling him to push forward, to reclaim the moment, to force the situation back into a shape he understood, but something else, something quieter and far more reliable, held him back. That instinct that had kept him in control for years, the one that recognized when a situation was no longer predictable, when the outcome was no longer guaranteed, and Marcus Reed stood at the center of that uncertainty without making a single move to claim it, which only made it more real, more undeniable, because control that is taken can be challenged, but control that simply exists without effort is something else entirely. One of Tyler's men glanced toward the exit of the shower area, not openly, not enough to draw attention, but enough to signal that the certainty they walked in with had fractured, and fractures spread quickly in a place like this. Marcus's presence did not change, but the perception of him did, and that shift moved faster than any physical action could have. In the span of a few seconds, he was no longer the old man they had surrounded, he was something undefined, something that did not fit into the roles they understood, and that made him unpredictable, and unpredictability was the one thing no one in that room wanted to deal with. The older inmate near the wall finally looked directly at Marcus, not with curiosity, but with recognition and a quiet respect that had nothing to do with status or strength, but with understanding, because he had seen this before, long ago, in a different environment where men like Marcus were not underestimated, where that level of composure was not ignored but studied, respected, even feared. Tyler shifted his stance once more, but this time the movement lacked purpose. It was no longer about positioning, it was about deciding, about choosing whether to continue forward or step back, and that decision, simple as it seemed, carried more weight than anything that had happened so far, because it would define how the rest of the block saw him, not just in this moment, but in every moment after. Marcus gave him nothing to work with, no aggression, no challenge, no visible threat, just that same steady presence that now felt immovable, like something anchored far deeper than the surface of the situation, and that was the final realization that settled into Tyler's mind, that whatever advantage he thought he had walking into that space no longer applied, that whatever outcome he had expected was no longer within reach. And that continuing forward would not restore control, it would risk losing it completely. The water continued to run, unchanged, but now it felt like a backdrop to something far more significant, a shift that did not need to be loud to be absolute. Tyler exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just enough to signal a decision that no one would openly acknowledge, but everyone would understand, and without a word, without a gesture meant to save face, the space between him and Marcus remained unbroken, not by force, not by dominance, but by something far more rare in that environment, restraint, and in that restraint, the outcome became clear, not as a victory or a defeat, but as a shift in power that had already taken place, quietly, completely, and without a single unnecessary move. The decision was made without a word, and that was what made it echo far beyond that moment, because in a place where everything was usually loud, obvious, and forceful, silence carried more meaning than any display of dominance ever could. Tyler Collins did not step forward again, and just as importantly, he did not step back in any dramatic way either. He simply held his position for one final second, as if acknowledging something only he could feel, before shifting his weight and turning slightly, not enough to signal retreat to an untrained eye, but enough for everyone who understood the language of that place to recognize what had just happened. The circle that had formed around Marcus Reed loosened almost immediately, not by command, not by instruction, but by instinct, each man adjusting his position just enough to create space, just enough to remove the pressure that had once been so deliberate. And that space spoke louder than anything else in the room, because it was given, not taken. Marcus did not move to fill it, did not follow, did not react in any way that could be interpreted as victory. He simply remained where he was, steady, grounded, unchanged, as if the entire situation had unfolded exactly as expected. The water continued to run, its steady rhythm now returning to the foreground, but the atmosphere had already been rewritten. The tension that had once filled the room was gone, replaced by something quieter, something more cautious. The younger inmates avoided looking directly at Marcus as they moved away, not out of fear, but out of an instinct they could not fully explain, the kind that told them there were things in that environment they did not yet understand, and it was better not to challenge them. The older inmate near the wall gave a small, almost imperceptible nod before turning away, not as acknowledgement, but as confirmation, because what he had witnessed was not a confrontation. It was a shift in hierarchy, one that had happened without noise, without spectacle, and therefore could not be easily undone. Tyler paused near the edge of the shower area, his back partially turned, his expression unreadable to most, but to those who knew him, there was something different in the way he held himself, a recalibration, subtle but real, because for the first time in a long time, he had encountered something that did not respond to pressure, something that could not be controlled through the usual means. And that realization would stay with him long after this moment ended. Marcus finally moved then, not toward anyone, not in response to anything, but simply stepping forward with the same calm precision he had carried from the beginning, his movements unhurried, deliberate, as if the space around him had always belonged to him and he was merely continuing through it. And as he passed through the area where the circle had once formed, no one stepped into his path. No one tested the boundary again, because the boundary had already been defined, not by force, but by presence, and that made it far more absolute. The room slowly returned to its usual rhythm, voices low, movements cautious, but beneath it all, something had changed, something that would ripple through the block long after the water stopped running, because moments like that did not disappear, they became stories, and stories in a place like this shaped reality. They determined who was untouchable, who was respected, who was left alone. And as Marcus Reed walked out of that shower room without a single unnecessary glance, it became clear to everyone who had witnessed it that they had just seen something rare, something that did not need to be repeated to be understood, and from that moment on, no one would ever look at him the same way again. The story did not stay in that shower room, it moved, quietly at first, carried in low voices and passing glances, spreading through Block C the way all important things did, not announced, not explained, but repeated just enough times that it became something more than a moment, it became a pattern others could recognize, and by the time the morning count ended, the name Marcus Reed no longer meant what it had the day before. Men who had not even been present began to hear about it, each version slightly different, each detail shaped by the person telling it, but the core never changed: an old man, one arm, surrounded, and somehow untouched by everything that was supposed to happen, and in a place built on reputation. That was enough. Marcus moved through the corridors the same way he had since arriving, steady, quiet, never drawing attention, but now attention found him anyway, not openly, not in a way that would challenge him, but in the subtle ways that mattered more. Conversations paused when he passed, eyes followed him just long enough to confirm what they had heard, then quickly looked away, not out of fear, but out of understanding, because in that environment, attention could be a form of pressure, and no one wanted to apply pressure to something they did not fully understand. Tyler Collins heard the story more than once before midday, each time from a different voice, each time with the same underlying message, not exaggerated, not dramatized, just stated as fact, and that consistency made it harder to dismiss. He sat in his usual spot during lunch, his posture relaxed, his presence still commanding, but his focus was elsewhere, replaying the moment in his mind, not searching for what went wrong, but trying to understand what had never been visible in the first place, because nothing about Marcus Reed fit the patterns he had built his control around, and that made him an unknown variable, and unknown variables could not be forced, they had to be studied. Across the room, Marcus ate in silence, his movements unchanged, his routine consistent, as if nothing had happened, as if the shift that everyone else felt had not touched him at all, and that only reinforced the story, because true control did not need acknowledgement, it did not need confirmation, it simply existed. The older inmate who had witnessed everything sat 2 tables away, watching without staring, his expression calm, almost thoughtful. Because he understood something the others did not yet fully grasp, that what they had seen was not just discipline, it was experience shaped over decades, the kind that did not come from theory or training alone, but from situations where control was the only thing that separated order from chaos, and men who carried that kind of experience did not lose it, no matter where they ended up. By the time the afternoon rolled in, the hierarchy of Block C had not been publicly challenged, nothing had been declared, no lines had been redrawn in any official sense, and yet everyone felt the difference, subtle but undeniable, a shift in how space was respected, how boundaries were understood. Tyler remained in control, but it was no longer absolute, not in the way it had been before, because there was now something else in that environment, something that existed outside of his influence. And that alone was enough to change how every future interaction would unfold. Marcus finished his meal and stood, moving through the room with the same quiet precision, and as he passed by Tyler's table, there was no exchange, no acknowledgement, no challenge, just 2 men existing in the same space under a new understanding that did not need words, and in that silence, the truth of what had happened settled fully into the block, not as a confrontation remembered, but as a reality accepted, that there was now a presence within those walls that did not need to prove anything to anyone, and that made it something far more powerful than anything they had seen before. By nightfall, nothing looked different, and yet everything had changed. The lights buzzed the same way, the guards walked the same routes, the routines held steady down to the minute, but beneath all of it, something had settled into the foundation of Block C, something that could not be undone because it had not been forced into place. It had revealed itself naturally, and that made it permanent. Marcus Reed sat on the edge of his bunk, his posture relaxed, his breathing slow and measured, the same way it had been in the shower, the same way it had been all day, unchanged by the attention, unaffected by the shift around him, because for him, nothing had changed at all. This was simply another environment, another space to observe, another system to understand, and that was what separated him from everyone else. Not strength, not age, not even experience, but perspective. He did not see the prison the way the others did, as a hierarchy to fight within, but as a structure to move through without disruption. Across the block, conversations were quieter now, more careful, not out of fear, but out of awareness. The kind that develops when something new enters the system and no one wants to be the first to test it. Tyler Collins stood near the railing overlooking the lower tier, his arms resting lightly, his expression neutral, but his mind active, turning over every detail, not with frustration, but with calculation. because control had not been taken from him, it had been redefined, and he understood enough to know that forcing the issue again would not restore what had shifted, it would only expose the limits of what he could command, and that was a risk he was not willing to take. Not yet. A few feet behind him, one of his men started to speak, then stopped, sensing that this was not the moment for questions, because even they understood now that something about Marcus Reed did not follow the usual rules. The older inmate who had watched everything from the beginning lay back on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, a faint expression of respect crossing his face, not for what had been done, but for what had not been done, because restraint like that, control like that, was rare, and it carried more weight than any display ever could. Marcus stood after a moment, moving toward the small barred window at the end of his cell, the night air slipping through just enough to carry the distant sounds of the outside world, cars passing somewhere far beyond the walls, a reminder that time moved differently here, slower, heavier, but still moving. He looked out without focusing on anything in particular, his expression calm, unreadable, as if the walls around him were just another detail, not a limitation, and in that quiet moment, the truth of his presence became clear in a way that no one could ignore anymore. He was not part of the system, not bound by it, not shaped by it, he existed alongside it, untouched by the forces that controlled everyone else. And that made him something entirely different, something the block had no name for. Something it could only adapt to. As the lights dimmed slightly signaling the approach of night count, the final realization settled across the tier, not spoken, not acknowledged, but fully understood, that there were two kinds of power in that place, the kind that demanded attention, and the kind that did not need it, and from that day forward, everyone knew exactly which kind Marcus Reed carried. Because when power does not need to prove itself, it does not fade, it does not weaken, it simply waits, steady and unshaken, and in a place built on constant challenges, that kind of power always lasted the longest.